Hello, it's Scott Manley here with episode 76 of Interstellar Quest, and it will be a sad day for the Kerbal astronaut corps because this episode has nothing but automated probes, but they are doing magnificent things. We're going to start with our dual explorer making final course corrections for arrival at the tiny moon BOP, which is the smallest moon in the Joule system and really marks the end of a long and fruitful voyage by this smallest of spacecraft. It is one of the oldest spacecraft in my Kerbal fleet. It has undergone major changes since its departure. The laws of physics in places appear to have changed. The ion drive on this is now 4 times more powerful than it was when it launched, no doubt due to some sort of clever optimizations by the developers of such systems. Who knows, but we're going to exploit its extra power to make sure that we get into BOP's orbit as close as possible. Now, interesting thing about BOP is that its mountains, the highest mountains, are higher than the low altitude science. So technically it's possible to be landed on the surface of BOP, or be mere meters above the surface of BOP, and still only get far from BOP science. So you have to actually dip down between the mountains if you're going to get all the science you can. But I think that with this new enhanced ion drive that we actually might be able to perform a landing. We will have to ascertain that once we have collected all the orbital science. But yet slowing down, and what you see here is I move my nav ball kind of orientation back and forth to try and bring my periaps down. I don't want it much lower than about 25. I'm not sure where the highest mountains are, but you definitely don't want to be low enough that you hit these things. But having crossed into this sphere of influence, it's now time for us to do the good old science acquisition routine. The gravity levels are fluctuating slightly, not enough to cause any obvious problems, but enough to indicate that there is more to BOP than we currently understand. Whatever could that be? And the only other thing we have that works at this time is the magnetometer. Log the magnetometer. Are Krakens magnetic? The Kraken? The Kraken, you say? Why do you ask that? And in a fine example of never giving up, the people behind this space program have finally figured out how to deploy this antenna despite the fact that the software for it was removed, almost a year ago. Look, we now have this beautiful orange unfolded antenna which can talk to whatever is on the little moon of BOP. And with our orbital insertion maneuver planned and our antenna deployed, we are now getting some clues that something is perhaps strange about BOP. Yes, during the infamous Duna arrival disaster, the ever-vigilant K.R.A.K.E.N noted an interesting energy signature which he found had never seen before and has never seen since. But now, the boffins back at Mission Control are perhaps getting some indication of where that strange energy signature came from. Yes, the semi-secret project, the Kerbal Radio Astronomy Kilohertz Emission Nexus project, has finally borne fruit and perhaps located its source on the surface of BOP. And of course their first request is to get a closer look. They're going to have to bring this spacecraft down lower over the surface than it would otherwise be safe. It will be below the peaks of some mountains, but it needs to get that close to actually start getting data from its thermometer and other close proximity instruments. We can see Joule there with just a thin sliver of its daylight side. Clearly we are deep on the dark side of BOP here. But that's great because it means less interference from the sun. Magnetospheric data. Here we go. Are Krakens magnetic? I believe that's one of the questions we're trying to answer here. Okay, now, the next thing we're looking for is our gravitometer, the gravioli detector. Orbiting BOP allows for scans of the varied surface. Interesting stuff! Yes, very interesting. And now the thermometer is brought to bear on the situation. It doesn't say if it's in Celsius or Fahrenheit. However, confusing those in a space program probably isn't as bad as confusing feet per second and meters per second. So having collected all that data and sent it back to the Kerbal Radio Astronomy Kilohertz Emission Nexus project, we are going to continue to try to navigate across the surface of BOP and see how this engine performs. There is a white, there's a large kind of blasted area there that we're going to fly over. It will be on the daylight side of the little moon here. There is there's the sun. There is our target. So first thing, actually, I'm going to look at this, firing up my engine, bringing the orbit over that whitish area there. It could be an impact crater, who knows, but we will get lower over it and see how well we can navigate. Obviously being very careful here to make sure we don't actually hit any mountains, since we are going to be zipping between their peaks at a whole 176 meters per second, which may seem rather slow for an orbit, but you have to remember that's still pretty darn fast if you're, say, in a car. If you have a car that's capable of going that fast, then you're running something serious. There we go. They're just pointing south, taking a good look at this terrain, scanning it for further clues as to the anomaly that is so perplexing the scientists back home at the K.R.A.K.E.N. project. And as it comes over the hill, it's very clear that this is some giant impact crater, which has exposed new, fresh regolith, which has a different colour. Firing up the engine to full thrust, a full tiny fraction of a G, we're going to slow ourselves down and see if we can actually hang over the target. If we can't hang, then the landing will be off, but if we can demonstrate a landing in orbit, that will be a good, test as to whether we can actually perform the descent all the way. Okay, so we've now essentially stopped our spacecraft and we are still showing positive motion, so let's start letting it drop. Now, it turns out that, because after having tested this a lot, that the engine is so marginal that as you go up and down, the inverse square law on the planet's or the moon's gravity makes it harder and harder to rise, or harder and harder to overcome the gravity. So what will be a stable attitude configuration at 20 kilometers becomes unstable at 10 kilometers. But look, we're gonna slide this thing carefully down past the edge of the crater. Let's see how close we can get. There is the shadow there. Do you see that? Beautiful, just sliding sideways over the surface of BOP at significant suborbital velocities. This test is indeed showing that the newly upgraded engine in this spacecraft will be able to carry it to a soft landing on the surface of BOP. The question is, where? Well, to actually test that out, we're going to have to get back into orbit and perhaps do some further scans of the planet. Until then, we know what this thing is capable of. We know that this is the little probe that could. We just need to find the target that it should really visit. So you can see I'm rising out, and I'm going to go into a polar orbit because I'm very specifically looking for a target. And if you want to scan the entire body of a body that's rotating, then you need to be orbiting over the poles, at least the poles according to the axis of rotation. And they're getting up there, back above 20 kilometers, 25 kilometers. 25 kilometers is the cutoff for the time acceleration, incidentally. So I want to leave it up there as I go back to another spacecraft elsewhere in the Kerbal system. The Falcon space probe. Another aging spacecraft, ready to do something it was never designed to do, but something we all know it is capable of. This is us heading towards the planet Moho at 3,000 plus kilometers per second. At this distance from the sun, we're going at 20 kilometers per second, but our velocity relative to Moho is probably more on the order of about 3. There we go, we're about to cross into the sphere of influence, And we are very nicely on course for this target here. I'm going to hopefully put it down, or rather not so much put it down, but slam it into the daylight side because it'll look cooler. The Kerbal astronomers had asked for us to slam it into the dark side so that they could view the flash with their space telescope. However, it was realised that the space telescope in the space station needs a little bit of work and is in the wrong place altogether, and therefore isn't actually very useful. So we're just going to have to get all the seismic data we can. So switching over to the Moho lander to make sure that the instrumentation is set up correctly for this all-important critical encounter with this target. Come on, there we go. Look at that. Oh, look at the antenna sticking up in the surface. The nearest thing it has to a flag. Oh, I bet you it's excited to have a friend come over to its place after spending all this time alone. Unfortunately, they won't be seeing much. In fact, they won't be seeing each other at all, but they might hear. At best, we're hoping he will hear the seismic waves generated as the Falcon, unable to change course at this time, slams into the sun-blasted surface of Moho at almost 3 kilometers per second. Impact recorded. Science report can now be accessed from one of your accelerometers deployed on the planet. Look at that beautiful trail it left. Falcon crashed into Moho. 185 days, 4 hours, 45 minutes and 18 seconds. But what legacy has the Falcon left behind? Let us collect the data from the seismic accelerometer. Falcon impacted into Moho, producing seismic activity. From this data, information on the structure of Moho's crust can be determined. Not just the crust, but the interior, we hope. Transmitting that home with all possible. Oh wait, we're out of power. Oh wait, I should deploy my other solar panels. Yeah, if you ever wonder how we get information about the interior of the Earth, it is all down to seismic waves and how they travel differently through like liquids versus solid rocks. It's very interesting science. A science that I'm not really an expert on, so before I get into too much detail, I'm gonna shut up, because the more detail you have, the more likely some expert will tell you you're wrong. Moving swiftly on, with the emphasis being on the swiftly, we are starting a new major space mission. So this spacecraft, well, we're using some rather low-tech engines on the outside, but that's because the core doesn't have the thrust-to-weight ratio needed to escape from Kerbin's gravity just yet. Now, the most important feature of this is the new fusion drive here. This is the DT inertial confinement fusion system. Now, what that means is it's an inertial confinement fusion system, obviously, where you have a pellet of deuterium, tritium covered in a case. You zap that with lasers. The case blows off, and the reaction of that case blowing off compresses the deuterium and tritium, and you get a miniature nuclear explosion. What you do is you do that in the middle of a hydrogen stream, and then you impart that energy into a hydrogen, into your reaction mass, right? Which means you can get thrust out of it, more thrust. And by adjusting the amount of hydrogen, then you can get higher thrust at the same level of energy. So the DT engine is really kind of cool. At maximum thrust, it is incredibly efficient. It needs about 2.5 gigawatts of power continuously, which is actually way less than this energy this reactor will actually supply. But in terms of its form factor, this was a good size and shape. Remember, we are trying to fly this thing using Ferrum Aerospace, and once we're above like 35 kilometers, we will ditch these wings. So that doesn't feel so stable anymore. Keep going! That would be unfortunate. So the nice thing about this engine is that once you throttle down, the power required doesn't decrease. What it decreases is the amount of hydrogen being injected into the chamber, which means that the hydrogen absorbs more energy from from these pellets, and therefore is expelled even faster. So by decreasing the thrust, your specific impulse goes way, way up. And so you can get further by firing at a lower thrust, and if you really need a super high thrust, then you can fire it at full thrust. And so it's the best of everything. It is one of the best engines in the Interstellar mod, and it is a real concept, right? It is a real concept found throughout science fiction. And it will probably be my workhorse engine from this point out until I've developed something even crazier. Speaking of even crazier, we are about to try landing an ion propulsion spacecraft on a moon. As we discussed earlier, the Kerbal Radio Astronomy Kilohertz Emission Nexus has now been located near the North Pole of Bop. And it's just a question of using a spacecraft ill-designed for this purpose to get in, and get close, and get personal with this thing now dubbed the Kraken. So the first thing I need to do is slow my orbital velocity. I have a rough idea of where it is from various passes. I don't have any Kerbal engineer or anything left on this spacecraft, so I'm entirely having to use actual, visual location. I'm having to use my eyes. It's a good thing that I have an actual. It's a good thing I've seen this before. So it is. You can see that tiny white dot just there next to the spacecraft now, and I'm going to have to kind of do some lateral adjustments here. This took a really long time. I flew most of it at 2 times physics acceleration, and there's going to be a 4 time post acceleration applied to this thing. But with its super low thrust and super low gravity, this thing moves very, very slowly. It almost feels like an oil tanker, but the truth is it's just very light and very slow acceleration. So there's a lot of work needed to try and bring me as close to this little spot as possible. At full thrust, we have about 40 minutes of fuel, and I guess to counteract gravity, we have to run at about 66% thrust. So yeah, we've got about an hour to actually do this. It doesn't take nearly so long, but I'm doing it, you can see I'm moving it now 5 meters per second at this time, and kind of wobbling back and forth as you want to make sure that you're not descending too quickly. It's very easy to find yourself falling towards the surface so quickly that you cannot stop yourself. And I'm just adjusting the camera here. This descent was kind of like a slow motion panic. So what I did there was I turned the spacecraft so that the axis of the spacecraft was aligned with the target. That meant that I could get a much better idea of what way I needed to move to make sure I arrived at the Kraken. You can actually see it taking shape there. I think I see a tentacle. Now where's its big yellow eyes and its beak? I want to see them up close. Yes, this is completely unanticipated. The Kerbals know for certain that they are not alone in this universe. What is this thing here? Where did it come from? All we know is that it may be responsible for the untimely and unexpected destruction, self-destruction at that point, they thought, of various pieces of Kerbal hardware. Now moving at less than 3 meters per second, we're attempting to get as close to this fascinating target as possible. And with that wobble, I think it's time we switched out of time accelerated mode and bring back old Scott. Okay, I have no idea how big this thing is. I guess now I actually have an idea of how big it is. Okay, so it's only a few meters big, and the surface must be there. Where's the surface? 2 meters per second. Oh! Yes, I think we have a touchdown here. We have a touchdown at the Kraken. The Kraken, the big green football thing. It looks like, I don't know, I have to ask whoever modeled it. Did they base it on a watermelon with some, that would be an interesting thing to do it up as a dish. Oh, look, it's a Kraken watermelon with, I don't know, something coming out. And I noticed the Kraken is clipping through the dish rather like as if it's breaking the laws of physics or something. Speaking of physics, let's ask what the gravioli detector thinks of the situation. The sensor is giving odd readings here. You think? We have a tentacle stuck through our spacecraft. If that's not strange, I don't know what is. Okay, what else? We have to get in and get the thermometer. There it is, just in there. Too hot thermometer. Oh, log temperature. We've already log temperature. What is that? Is that interesting? Oh no, we don't care about that. Log the temperature. Log the temperature. The thermometer reads 66.6 degrees Celsius. That can't be right. Yes, indeed, the Kraken is doing strange things to the physics around it, including clipping through the surface. So yes, that is the end of the mission for the Joule Explorer. We will continue with this in a future episode. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.